On the U.S. territory of Guam in the Pacific, built on Orote Peninsula, is Naval Base Guam. Its location played a crucial role in World War II, being a strategic base before, during, and after the war. Before the war, the island was cut mostly off from the outside world. The Pan Am China Clipper flew into this area 4 times weekly, where barges would refuel the plane and bring the passengers here to the Skyways Hotel. Around the hotel was the village of Sume, the largest village on Guam. Traveling up the hill, we come across the Trans-Pacific Cable Station, and a little bit further the Marine Barracks. There were 6 officers and 148 enlisted men. The barracks was a 2-story building beside a parade ground, though the second story was damaged by a typhoon in 1941. Behind that were homes for the officers. Across the parade ground was a 9-hole golf course. Officers were expected to be married and to bring their family with them until November 1941, when all family members were sent home. In the days leading up to the attack at Pearl Harbor, all sensitive documents were destroyed, ammunition was handed out, and pay canceled. However, combat preparations were limited to trips to the rifle range and marching to potential defensive zones. The Japanese too made preparations, with aircraft known as Peets flying over Orote Point frequently. Saboteurs were inserted on the island and cut all power phone lines after the attack at Pearl Harbor. When the Japanese attacked, they began with land-based bombers flying out of Saipan. 9 were in the first wave that struck Sume. Most residents of Sume were in this chapel at this location as the planes flew overhead. Quickly realizing the danger, many residents fled to these caves overlooking the village. In the harbor was the USS Penguin, a minesweeper under command of Lieutenant James Haviland, with 4 officers and 50 enlisted aboard. Considered an easy post, the Penguin's main duty was a daily patrol around the island that the crew used as a fishing trip. As war loomed, the patrols were switched to nighttime using blackout procedures, though the fishing continued. Mooring in the outer harbor after her nightly patrol, Lieutenant Haviland released several crew to go ashore while the rest would repair a leak in the boiler. A message from shore alerting him to the attack was quickly followed by the sound of bombs. At the order of General Quarters all hands, a sailor cut the lines to the mooring point and anchor with an axe. As the attack began, she put out to sea to be able to move about. 3 Peets chased after the Penguin. As she had the heaviest weapons on the island, she pushed the bombers to higher altitudes and successfully shot down 1 plane with her 3-inch gun. Bombs fell on both sides of the ship, not doing any damage. But a strafing pass destroyed most of the lifeboats, caused leaking, and injured many of the crew. Ensign R.G. White was at his post directing the 3-inch anti-aircraft gun when a bullet ricocheted off the turret just before the ship cleared the harbor. He died within minutes. Lieutenant Haviland, his arm almost cut off by shrapnel, ordered the ship scuttled. Ensign's White body and the most seriously wounded were placed on the remaining life rafts, while the rest of the crew, most injured themselves, swam for 3 hours to get the mile back to shore. The executive officer, Ensign Wood, did a final sweep of the ship and found the boiler crew still at their posts, having missed the order to abandon ship. They made it off as the stern settled in the water. The whole battle was visible to the Marines at Sume, who rushed down to give aid to the crew. All survived the swim, as well as their 2 mascots. On shore, most of the military targets were not heavily damaged by the aerial bombardments. However, bombs killed 1 at the radio station, and several Marines were wounded running across the golf course to cover. One was heard to cry out, "Where's Superman when you need him?" The Pan Am building suffered heavy damage, as employees emptied the safe and destroyed anything the Japanese could use. A second wave of 15 planes followed in the afternoon. That night, residents from Sume and Pan Am employees joined the crowds fleeing to the mountains, where they were safe but uncomfortable. The next day saw more bombing, as residents scavenged to gather supplies. High on the list were mosquito nets. The last message from the Pan Am radio was sent at this time. "Guam under attack. Stop. So far no company casualties. Stop. Landing imminent. Stop. Goodbye. Japanese transport ships came into view. Anything of use remaining, such as construction tractors, were prepared for destruction. Through a series of contradicting orders, the Sume Marines were left unable to mount a real defense, so many fled into the jungle. When the governor decided to surrender, the remaining Marines lowered their flag to taps and buried it. They were found by the Japanese sitting in the parade ground, waiting for capture. Those who fled to the jungle were captured over the next few days. Washington, D.C. declared them all as missing in action 3 days later. As the war raged on in other places, it became apparent to the Japanese they would have to prepare defenses on Guam. Locals were used as forced labor to build fortifications, such as these 2 bunkers at Gab Gab. They demonstrate a major principle of beach defense the Japanese had learned the hard way. Instead of having bunkers pointed straight out to sea, they were pointed along the beach. This makes them harder to spot and destroy from offshore, while still allowing interlocking fields of fire. Another bunker, here at Daddy Beach, was made for heavier artillery pieces. In preparation for the invasion, even old forts from the Spanish colonial era were retrofitted to serve modern artillery pieces. Of greatest fame, an airfield was built on Orote Peninsula. When the American counter-invasion began, the Japanese learned of the landing sites through the intense bombardments that occurred at 2 specific beaches that straddled Orote Peninsula. They occurred for several weeks, and then due to an expected naval battle, the fleets left, and then they returned and shelled the exact same areas. The power of the bombardment is shown by this plant called Tangen Tangen. Over 90% of the vegetation was stripped away by the heavy bombardment, so in the time after America had secured the island, Tangen Tangen seeds were airdropped to reduce erosion. Also, occasionally massive shell craters can be found, weathered by time. Anti-aircraft guns found scattered around the base, mostly on display. This twin-barreled Type 96 AA gun, tucked away behind the telegraph station, and others like it, downed 16 American planes in the run-up to the invasion. The Japanese lost planes as well. As this Val bomber can attest, the open cockpit indicates the pilot escaped. These piers were made for refueling seaplanes, though now they are mostly only used for divers going to visit the plane. As one of the initial objectives of the attacking American forces, Orote Peninsula quickly became the scene of heavy fighting. Hills surrounded by rice paddies made great fortresses. On the second day of attempting to capture the peninsula, a forward battle line was established across the neck of the peninsula. The 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 22nd Marines advanced up the Sume Agate Road, which this modern road follows the trail of. The attack was delayed for an hour to allow for extra bombardment. 1st and 3rd Battalions began advancing up the road with tanks. To reach their objective, they had to avoid aerial bombs used as mines, clear pillboxes, and destroy coconut log obstacles. 5 Japanese tanks counterattacked, but they were quickly destroyed. A few hundred yards short of their objectives, the Marines consolidated and bedded down for the night. 2nd Battalion was sent to cut across the peninsula, on a path that now leads through a hill where sits the Naval Exchange Store, and through this mangrove forest. As soon as the Marines began advancing, the Japanese launched a counterattack. The confusion caused by this was compounded by friendly artillery landing on U.S. troops, but this did not stop the Marines for long. They quickly reached their objective. Artillery pieces such as these, found on display around the base, were placed on these cliffs facing the sea, firing down at naval ships. A destroyer was dispatched to deal with them. The next day, the Marines were told to dig in and rest, though heavy fighting continued. Artillery placed here on Turtle Island became particularly troublesome. The Marines did extend their lines through the mangroves, completely cutting off the peninsula. Japanese leadership attempted to remove their forces from the peninsula by barges from Sume, but this plan was quickly sunk. The barge wreckage may be from one of the boats. That night, the Japanese soldiers prepared themselves for a banzai charge from the mangrove. Clutching both issued and makeshift weapons, they came screaming out of the mangroves, and darkness and heavy rain kept airplanes from flying. As was always the case, artillery and machine guns tore them up, with only a few making it to American lines. Those who retreated back into the mangroves found no shelter from the artillery that chased them there. The next morning, the Japanese used the trick of timing their artillery to those of American artillery so the Americans would be demoralized by the supposed friendly fire. Still, the Marines advanced. This road also roughly coincides with the road at the time of World War II. The marsh still exists to the left, though the mangroves that gave the Marines so much trouble has been replaced by a sewer treatment plant. A 200-yard stretch between the marsh and mangrove had been well prepared. Sherman tanks stopped to lay down a base of fire while infantry advanced to take out bunkers, but heavy fire drove them to the ground. They had to crawl back with the tanks firing their main cannons only a few feet over their heads. Later, advancing on the same road again, Marines encountered poorly hidden mines blocking the tanks. One man, under cover of smoke and fire, disarmed most of the mines. They pushed forward across what is now the Charles King Fitness Center. On the right side of the advance, similar actions took place, though at one point the Japanese broke and madly retreated from their prepared positions. This allowed the Marines to advance to these cliffs overlooking Sume, with clear fields of fire towards the old Marine barracks and the airfield. The telegraph station bears the bullet holes from the fighting. The next day saw more slow but deadly action as the Marines advanced. Shermans were sent up to support. This housing area is partially built on the pre-war rifle range for the Marine barracks, where the Japanese had to create a defend-or-die line. Around 250 separate bunkers were found here. The fighting was so fierce that mass graves were made for killed Japanese. This housing area is also built on top of one of those mass graves. The bodies were exhumed before construction. Marines moved to secure the bombed-out remains of the Marine barracks in Sume village. The only sign of pre-war Marines in the barracks were the building plaque, a pillow made from an American flag, and a few trinkets. With only scattered resistance remaining, Marines played to the colors on the Japanese bugle at the barracks as the American flag was raised there once again. Sume was found to be one of the most heavily mined areas on Guam. These cliffs past Sume were filled with caves and other prepared positions, though little trace of them remains today. This monument to war dogs is appropriately placed here, as war dogs were used to search for Japanese stragglers hiding in the jungle. 25 of them would die on Guam. The dog portrayed here is Kurt. He was hit by a mortar blast. While Kurt made it to surgery, he did not last long after. His handler held him in his arms to protect him from the shaking of the 16-inch shells till Kurt stopped breathing. The handler then laid down and fell asleep with his head on Kurt's chest. The dogs were buried in rice paddies beside the Marine graveyard. The monument was originally in Asan, then Dedido, and now here. Turtle Island was investigated, but none of the artillery reported on it was found. Fighting would continue for the rest of the island, and Japanese stragglers would continue to be found until after the war. But for Orote Point in the main area of Naval Base Guam, the fighting was over. Now that the local combat was over, General Shepard's words that the capture of the Marine barracks would be fulfilled. On this hallowed ground, you officers and men of the 1st Marine Brigade have avenged the loss of our comrades who were overcome by a numerically superior enemy 3 days after Pearl Harbor. Under our flag, this island again stands ready to fulfill its destiny as an American fortress in the Pacific. And an American fortress Guam did become. Immediately after capturing Orote Airfield while the battle was still raging, naval engineer units moved in and had it operational within 6 hours. A test landing by a Navy TBF was quickly followed by artillery spotter planes using it as a base. The airfield was expanded and used by many planes for the rest of the war, including this Marine Corsair that missed the runway and crashed into the jungle. Daily operations were run from this spot where the command building stood. Sume, already badly damaged, was permanently emptied of its inhabitants and torn down to make room for naval expansion. The inhabitants have never been able to re-inhabit the site, though descendants are allowed to visit. Much of the landscape was flattened as more and more troops were stationed on the island. This section of ground is an example, as it was at one point covered in Quonset huts. One of the ridges that Marines fought so hard to capture is no longer here. Breakwaters were established, including the great one that now surrounds Apra Harbor. This whole piece of land and others like it were created. Large chunks of the harbor bottom were dredged to provide better anchorage, and the dredgings were placed in locations such as here, next to the airfield. This ruined machine bears testament to the large size of the work taken on. On the other shores of Orote Point, these thin strips of metal are the only remains of an unknown object. However, much can be discovered just below the surface. A long pipeline, probably from an offshore refueling pier, stretches off to points unknown, surrounded by other debris left over from the war, including unexploded ordnance. Gab Gab and San Luis beaches were also improved, though in a different way. The hundreds of thousands of American military men needed relaxation, and these two beaches were modified to fit that need. In fact, these beaches are better known monuments to the Naval Construction Units, or Seabees, than this humble monument here. It was also during this time that Guam's most infamous animal arrived, the brown tree snake, probably a stowaway aboard a cargo ship from New Guinea. They have decimated much of the local bird population. While visitors may be scared by reports of how many snakes there are today, don't worry. To humans they are harmless, and you can go for years without seeing one. Also brought in were these anchors from Japanese ships, mainly wrecks in Saipan. Japanese prisoners were kept on the island as well. They were put to work in several locations. This block is all that remains of an amphitheater made by Japanese prisoners. By the War Dog Memorial and the old Marine barracks is this staircase, also built by Japanese prisoners. The writing on the side says, "In memory of prisoners of war on the island of Rota on the 27th day of the 7th month in the 21st year of the reign of Emperor Hirohito." This tractor sits mostly intact, deep below the surface of the water. While the civilian construction crews drove their vehicles over these cliffs to keep them from the Japanese in 1941, this particular model is from later in the war. It is probably not a casualty of battle or of an accident, but of corners cut. At the end of the war, everyone was in a great hurry to get home. However, all material had to be properly disposed of. One method homesick soldiers devised was to throw everything into the ocean. There were restrictions about what could be dumped and how far away it had to be from shore, but these rules were repeatedly ignored. With the drawdown of American forces on Guam, the jungle and the Tangan eventually reclaimed much. From a massive base for hundreds of thousands of fighting men, few things remain. Some artifacts are preserved better than others. While many locations have signs posted to describe their significance to the war, others lie forgotten. This platform, next to this staircase, near some small buildings with shell holes through them, are left with no names. Other monuments have suffered as well. This road was once lined with trees to represent casualties taken in the battle. 161 for 161 Marines who were killed. Storms have blown down most of the trees, knocked down like the men they represent. This park has a time capsule waiting to be opened. Buildings still lie in the forest, their histories forever lost. Explosives are still dug up during construction, as happened to this field. Pipes run off to nowhere. For all the history that was made, very little was recorded in files accessible to the everyday person, leaving us to wonder at what happened here, and to marvel over these relics of war.